We're here today at Myth 2, and it is interesting for us to remind ourselves what we're doing. The way that people used to talk about an education or about learning was that one was pursuing a line of inquiry. And we're trying to not do that. Instead of pursuing a line of inquiry, we're trying to generate a field of inquiry. It's a different process. Instruction always follows lines of ritual sequencing, and most education for the last 2,500 years has been based on the geometry of instructional sequence. And that particular quality came in with Aristotle. The use of a geometricity in an instruction education became then the standard for what used to be called the clear mind. And you were disciplined and trained and instructed to have a clear mind. By the early 20th century, it was quite clear that we had clear minds and we had scrambled feelings. We had atrophied intuition. We had diseased and weakened bodies. We had no ability to have an easy consciousness about art. There was just a deceptive sense of history. And science was almost untouchable and limited to a few stuffy little basement laboratories scattered like orphaned pebbles in maybe just a few places in the world. The educational technique is now 100 years out of date. Instead, we're generating a field of inquiry, which means instead of having a line of instruction that makes sense all the way so that the mind is comfortable in it, so that the mind understands, oh yes, this is what we're doing. Oh, this is exactly right. We're not doing that. We are, in fact, at every occasion where that habitually would want to come into play, we're moving at an oblique angle to keep away from it so that we're doing an improvisation rather than just following the score. And so we bunch together our Saturday mornings. We put them in groups of 4 because 4 is a very easy quality to work with without having to be geometric, though it does make a square, and does have a deep symbolic quality which we'll make use of. The phase of our education now is myth, and the next phase is symbol, and we'll see that we can make use of geometricity and of a clear mind, but not now, because we're concerned with myth, and myth is not concerned with the mind. Myth is a quality of heart. Myth is the experience of life in a heartful manner. The heart is not always happy. Sometimes it's filled with grief. And our experience has grief as well as joy. It has many different shades in between and all around. And the difference between the experience of feeling in myth and the existential going through emotion in ritual is a monumental difference. Emotion will always be formal and relate to an existential action that is repeatable and becomes not only rote, but becomes habitual to the level of being an instinct. And we saw in the previous phase that ritual is always to do with form, always with objectivity, but myth is not about objectivity, it's not about form, it is a process. And in this way, the process of experience flies along with the process of nature. They go together, and we saw in our very first phase, as we began generating our field of inquiry, that in order to start naturally, we had to not start with the mind, not to start with ideas of what it was that we were doing, but to allow the generation of the field of inquiry to go through its metamorphosis to the point to where we will have a very clear idea of what we're doing. We'll have a symbolic form of thought about what it is that we are doing, because we will at that point have done it, but have done it naturally. And so the whole ecology of our first year is to build by generation from nature through a phase of ritual objectivity, through another phase of the process of mythic experience, to the objective forms of the symbolic mind. And all this time, we're carrying through a complex tapestry of vibrations, of reverberations, of tones, of what best would be called the flow of mysteriousness as it occurs in nature and as it comes into emergence in objectivity, in existence, not just once, but iteratively, many, many times, billions of times per second. And so the whole universe, the objective universe, is in an iterative, vibratory dance of iteration. Electrons are constantly moving around. The atomic nucleus is constantly in vibration. The interplay of atomic and molecular and eventually cellular, all the way up on every scale in the universe, it is a vibrant universe. Vibrant because it occurs resonantly, and that the resonances assume sets and groups in what is now called self-organizing. No one plans it. No one organizes it. But the order occurs out of the process of nature, the way in which existence objectifies its emergence iteratively, and out of those two, out of the play between those two, out of the play between the process of nature and the objectivity of existence, comes a new process now, the process which we call myth, which is experience. And it isn't limited just to human beings. Animals have experience. Plants have experience. Not only animals and plants, but even fungi have experience. And it isn't just that animals and plants and fungi, which constitute 3 of the 5 kingdoms of life, as they used to say 100 years ago, we know now, at the beginning of the 21st century, that that whole range of plants, animals, and fungi, those 3 kingdoms of life, are little tiny twigs on an enormous branch of life called the eukarya. All organic life that has cells, cellular structure. And that the eukarya are only 1/3 of the tree of life, because there's a whole other two branches. One of the branches is bacteria. And the other branch is related to bacteria. And we talked about that in Nature, the archaea. We used Lynn Margulis's work on the microscopic origins in nature of life. And one of the qualities that came out of it, we appreciated, is that on this particular planet, bacteria have had 3 billion years of evolutionary experience before our kind of being was ever generated initially. So that life in its bacterial dimension has been around 3 billion years here, and we know now that life is ubiquitous in the universe and that star systems have been in existence for the last 13 billion years, so that there are organic life forms in the larger 21st century universe that have been around for 13 billion times a year, longer than our kind even emerged. And so we're having to shift our perspective, to shift our conception, and to modify it in such a way that we learn in keeping with that shift in perspective, that shift in conception. The difficulty is that even the words perspective, perception, carry with them a Greek geometric bias. And not only that, but that the classical Greek geometric bias was taken over by the Roman ethos, and for many, many hundreds of years, for close to 700 or 800 years, the Roman Latin mind, Latin language mind, corralled and reshaped, distorted the Greek bias and prejudice, and out of it came a view of society, a view of person, a view of how to learn that eventually became so freeze-dried, evaporated, stupid that we now call that whole era of Western history the Dark Ages, populated eventually by a frozen world of scholastics who had very clear minds in the Roman Latin mode of their squeezing and distorting the Greek mind, and we live in a world where it is no longer permissible, no longer acceptable to have that kind of insanity as the norm for how we are to be real, for how we are to live. And so this education, this learning is a complete new quality, a new dimension. And the generation of this field of inquiry has a particular kind of quality to it. We take pairs of books, and we take pairs of books each lunar cycle. Every month we take a new pair. And we use these two books paired as like a tuning fork for that particular grouping in the generation of our field of inquiry, so that each phase that we have has 3 groups of 4, 3 sets of pairs of books. And then in order to give ourselves definition so that the phases don't overlap and mulch, which they would do, and in the miseducated mind, there's no such thing as understanding phases distinctly. Everything is mulched together, and of course the dominant in that is always the prejudicial Western mind that is still based on all of the layers of bias and distortion that have happened in the past. Now, the first really strong critique of this, enormously powerful critique of this, was done by one of the texts. The woman was Jane Ellen Harrison, and her book came out in 1903, Prolegomena to the Study of Greek Religion. She, for a very first powerful time, took exception to the society in which she had been raised, the education by which she had been inculcated with all kinds of supposed natural, normal, distinguished features and habits, and came to understand that she was a distorted being, and that the entire society in which she found herself was a distorted society. And we today call that era Victorian British Empire. And she was raised in the Victorian British Empire. She was born in Yorkshire, where people are very blunt. They tell you exactly how it is. She says of Yorkshire people in her reminiscences that where she was raised by a taciturn father who could not stand to have any kind of what he called Papist influence, that Roman Catholic Italian religion had no place whatsoever in a good, decent Yorkshire English home. And so she was raised by a taciturn father. Her natural mother died in childbirth, and so she was raised by a stepmother who had been her teacher, who was a very talkative, Celtic kind of woman with a rather volatile temper. And so she grew in a home with a brother and a sister where there was a complete split between her parents, the mother and the father. One completely quiet and stubbornly insisting on everything being plain. Her mother all the time talking, all the time embellishing, and all the time creating the sense that the good Victorian British Empire girl should be seen and not heard. That she should never let herself observe some of the more indecent qualities of life, some of the more exciting qualities of human sexuality, of all kinds of things. And so she was funneled and funneled and funneled and telescoped in until she became a very good English girl raised in the Victorian British Empire. But one of the qualities of Jane Ellen Harrison is that she was an A-plus conscious being and eventually saw through all of the layers that came to her. And she said in her reminiscences done when she was about almost 60, she said, in my generation, 3 books startled us awake so that we realized that we could never again go back. The first, she said, was Aristotle's Ethics, because it showed us, she said, it happened that the Ethics was among the set books for my year at Cambridge to realize the release that Aristotle brought. You must have been reared as I was in a narrow school of evangelicism, reared with sin always present, with death and judgment before you, hell and heaven to either hand. It was like coming out of a madhouse into a quiet college quadrangle where all was liberty and sanity, and you became a law to yourself, the doctrine of virtue as the mean. What an uplift and revelation to one who was born to sin and had it drummed into you every day of your life until she became mature. and got to Cambridge University and began to shine in a very particular way. Her focus was on Greek art, and she became one of the first female lecturers on Greek art. She would, even as a student still, go and lecture at Eton and other schools, and this was unheard of, to have an intellectual woman coming out of Victorian British Empire ethos to be able to talk about the precision of Greek art. And for her, it was not only that, but there was another quality that came, and that was the precision went along with a mystical process that was revealed best to her. She said, in 1907 came a book by Henri Bergson called Creative Evolution, L'Evolution Créatrice. Off and on, I had read philosophy all my life, from the pre-Socratic Heraclitus to William James, but finally came the revelation of Bergson's creative evolution. That time is not at all discrete little things that go in sequences in lines, but that time is a durational flow without interruption. And in this durational flow, time is durée, there is a creative consciousness that emerges out of the élan, out of the energy, out of the dynamic of the process that from time to time becomes energy forms that position themselves comfortably, because the dynamic and the energy are all of the same flow. They're all natural. And that if we add our own experience, if we let it flow with nature's dynamic, with the energy of forms that really exist quite objectively out of nature, we will then have a quality where we are natural in our flow and no longer distorted in the kind of inculcated culture which has been given to us. And our experience then will free itself. And as the experience frees itself, different images will come into play. And as different images come into play, our range of feeling begins to extend itself. Now, we've talked about how this range of feeling comes into play in myth with the development for the first time of a different tone from ritual drumming, from ritual dancing. Out of it will come a completely different quality, the development of feeling in music. And we use music in the course, and talk about that in just a little bit. But the third book that influenced Jane Ellen Harrison and that generation to break away, not just from the tradition, not just from the culture, not just from the British Empire, not just from the Victorian ethos, but to completely break away from several thousand years of habitual civilization that had come to a dead end. The third book was Freud, Totem and Taboo. And she says, with Freud it was quite different. By temperament I am, if not a prude, at least a Puritan. And at first the ugliness of all of it sickened me. I hate a sick room and have a physical fear of all obsessions and insanity. Still I struggled on to read it, feeling somehow that behind and below all the sexual mud was something big and real. Then, fortunately, I lighted on totemism and taboo, and at once the light broke, and I felt again the sense of release. Here was a big constructive imagination. Here was a mere doctor laying bare the origins of Greek drama, as no classical scholar had ever done, teaching the anthropologist what really was meant by totem and taboo, probing the mysteries of sin, of sanctity, of sacrament, a man who, because he understood, purged the human spirit from fear. And so at the very same time as this was happening, she began to bring out the first of 3 editions of Prolegomena to the study of Greek religion. The 3rd edition came out in 1922 and is the one that's reprinted here. This is the original copy of it. And we're using the Princeton University reprint in their Mythos series. What she did here was to say the entire prison within which Western civilization had been jailed for several thousand years is not because of the power of the Romans so much and the consequent Middle Ages that came out of them and the consequent squashing of the Renaissance by counter-reformations and reformations and all kinds of nationalistic empire building to where the 19th century was almost like a replay of some ancient century out of the Roman Empire days. You had people like Napoleon claiming that they were going to make a new empire. And of course, the first place that the extended power of Napoleon envisioned going to get was not just the other European countries, but Egypt. To go and he took an enormous expedition to Egypt, not just to conquer it, but to assume it, to swallow it, because it was apparent that before there was a Rome, even before there was a Greece, there was an Egypt. And so the whole sense at the beginning of the 19th century was that one would have to go back before the Romans and the Greeks and go back to ancient Egypt, except that no one knew how to deal with ancient Egypt. And for a long time during the 19th century, before hieroglyphics were deciphered and translated, before all the discoveries of Egyptologists, all during the 19th century, it became more and more apparent that there was a creative interface not at the beginnings of Egypt, but somewhere about 16 or 1800 BC, and that what really influenced the Greeks, and from them the Romans, and from them the Middle Ages, and from them the Western world all the way up to the British Empire, all the way into the 20th century, that there was an origin before the Greeks. That's why she calls it a prolegomena. This is the study of what came before them. That the classical Greeks were formed around 600 BC, but about 1600 BC, 1,000 years before that, there was a very powerful civilization called in archaeology the Mycenaean Minoan civilization, and it spread from Crete along to Phoenicia on the coast of the Middle East, through Cyprus, Asia Minor, all the way up into the northern part of the Aegean, into Thrace, all the way along the Mediterranean Sea to Sicily and North Africa, to Italy, to some posts in Spain, and through the Gibraltar, even touching Great Britain, and that all of this Minoan, Mycenaean religious outlook was a mythology that was really at the origins of this whole interlocking train, and that one had to go back and recover a mythology that almost was unknown except in its stylized Greek or its distorted stylized Roman Greek, Greco-Roman form, or its Christianized medieval Roman Empire Greek distorted forms, so that it was like a Chinese puzzle box. And that the study of mythology by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, was like trying to unpeel an onion layered enigma where every layer went in a different direction and distorted in a different way. How do you cut through? How do you get through? And when you are doing this, as you peel the layers back more and more, how do you keep from not misunderstanding, from projecting or retrojecting the distortions that you think are clear mind, that you think are reasonable common sense? How do you go back in such a way that you are back there where they were, and you can understand how they were then? And as it became more and more clear, because of her book and the coterie of friends that she had at Cambridge University at that time, Sir James George Fraser, Gilbert Murray at Oxford, a whole raft of geniuses all looking at the same era, the same material in different facets, it became quite clear that even at 1,000 years before Solon reorganized Athens in 600 BC, that there were origins that went back even further. And that's where our other text that we're using, the Myths of Inanna. Inanna is written up as a mythology 1,000 years before the 1,000 years before the classical Greeks even began. She goes back 2,000 years. She goes back to 2400 BC. And even there, eventually, it was seen that the mythologies of 4,400 years ago were already highly stylized, highly influenced by who knows how many layers going back from that. So that it is a quality of our exploring of mythology, not simply to look at, say, Greek mythology and look at Greek mythology as Homer put the Olympian pantheon with Zeus at the head, and then the 6 female figures, the 6 male figures, Athena, Aphrodite. All of these figures go back many layers, many, many times. In Indo-European languages, the very first name that one hears in ancient Indo-European that eventually became the figure of Aphrodite is Anahita. Anahita. And the key phrase in that Ana became a part of the name of the writer of the Inanna. Inanna herself has Ana in it. The writer was Nadawana, and the world's first great writer was a woman. In fact, she was the daughter of Sargon the Great of Akkad. And when she wrote the Inanna material around 2300 BC, this is a quality that comes out of one of her hymns. This is a hymnal prayer of Nadawana, the Adoration of Inanna in Ur. This occurs in a large book, Ancient Near Eastern Texts Relating to the Old Testament, the 3rd edition with supplement, published by Princeton, and it has a second volume that has all the pictures that go with it. And in the pictures, one finds on page 199, illustration 606. You can take a look at it later during the break. Here is a Nadawana, daughter of Sargon, priestess of the moon god, on a disc from Ur. Ur being one of the earliest of the Sumerian cities. And of course, we have heard all of our lives about, because in the Old Testament, in the very first book of the Old Testament, in Genesis, is where Abraham came from. And so right away, the entire involvement here was not just with classical studies and empire criticisms and philosophic shifts, but the entire religious basis of Western civilization came suddenly under a scrutiny that it had never faced before. It had faced competing religious things. In the Crusades, Islam and Christianity vied with each other. In many different times, different Christian sects vied with each other. What happened at the beginning of the 20th century was the discovery that there were parallels going back further and further and further, so that in this same volume, one finds here a Sumerian wisdom text, a Sumerian variation of the Job motif, and it takes the story of Job back to 2000 BC, before Abraham was born. So that there were all kinds of intuitions that all of a sudden one was faced not only with critiques and criticisms, but the whole mythic structure began to dissolve. And as it dissolved, the feeling-toned security of life began to feel jeopardized. And the imagery that had been nicely placed all of a sudden fell apart and fell into oblique angles, so that you began to have the melting with art like Impressionism, and then you had the fracture of it with art like Cubism. And then you had the brutalization of it into abstract forms that had nothing natural in its imagery whatsoever. And all of this was happening at the very same time. Here is a translation of the first few lines of Inanna's hymnal prayer, the Adoration of Inanna. Queen of all the May is the ruling order power. Queen of all the May, radiant light, life-giving woman, beloved of An and Urash, much bejeweled, who loves the life-giving tiara fit for endship, who grasped in her hand the 7 May. And as these 7 May, like her tiara and her scepter and her robe, all of these ritual, objective, existential items that together constellate her existence as the royal woman goddess in the world. And it is these 7 that she progressively has to let go of as she descends into the netherworld, called on a mission that she must do, on an adventure that she must go through. And in order to go into the netherworld through the 7 levels, she must give up each one of these ritual items until she arrives completely nude, without any power of order in her existence. And so she comes to a point of zero gravity in terms of her existence at the center of the earth. Let's take a little break and we'll come back. Let's come back, and we're looking at iterations. We're looking at resonances. And we're understanding that the way the universe works is that energy in its dynamic form flows and has continuity. But when energy begins to collect, it becomes discrete. It becomes quantized, and one then becomes aware for the first time that something has come into existence and that it stays in existence because it continues to emerge, continues to iterate. So the only thing static in the whole universe is the idea that the universe is static. Everything else is in vibration. And because it's in vibration of consistently and constantly emerging discretely, it means that existentials are exact. And their exactness has a mysterious quality to it. Every single speck of everything is unified. So that the universe is the grand accumulation of unity. And so its oneness is one of the qualities that one can trust in existence. Not just that everything is only one, but that unity in the mode of integral characterizes the universe. All of the phases of our first year of generating a field of inquiry, of beginning to learn fresh, new, all of that first year is an integral. It has integration as its mode. But as we'll see, integration by itself is only an energized quality of discreteness, and complementary to that is a continuousness that is not quantized, is not one at all, but has the quality of zero, and at the same time the quality of infinity. And because the dynamic of nature has this zero infinite quality to it, change always brings into play empty infiniteness, if we can speak that way. There's always a zero infiniteness that comes into play in change, but not making change discrete, so that there are no elements of change outside of the existential, ritual iterations of energy as form. And so this produces a very mysterious quality when it comes to our experience and when it comes to myth, and one that was noticed by Jane Ellen Harrison to an extent that was unheard of before her. And her book became, Prolegomena to the Study of Greek Religion, became as famous as Freud's Totem and Taboo, as famous as Bergson's Creative Evolution, as famous as any of the translations of Aristotle. It became one of the qualities, like a talisman. By the time the third edition came out in 1922, it was one of the high water marks of a whole new world that was not announced in its completion, but had been announced by a trumpeting of beginning. And the other book that we're using Diane Volkstein and Samuel Noah Kramer's translation. There are other translations of Inanna, especially the Descent into Hell, N.K. Saunders, Betty Madar. There are books on Inanna, Descent of the Goddess, and many, many other versions and studies, but we're using this one because it brings out a quality that all of the others are not quite up to speed on. And the quality is this, that when we hear 4,400 years ago hymns to Inanna by Nadawana, we realize that in these hymns there are hymns of praise and there are hymns of lamentation. The two dominant sides of the feeling toned experience of ancient people, of people even today. Lamentation and grieving, joy and praising. And between them, all of the different shadings. And one comes to understand, finally, that this quality of hymning goes all the way through the tradition of civilizations, not just the West, but the ancient Near East, all the way, including India, so that the entire Indo-European swath of civilizations have this consistent quality in their hymning, and one finds eventually studies like this, 1936, from Uppsala in Sweden, the Akkadian and Hebrew Psalms of Lamentation as religious documents, showing that the book of Lamentations in the Old Testament is very much in the lineage of the ancient Akkadian lamentations and praises. The praises in the Old Testament are the Psalms of David. And that the Psalms of David and the Lamentations of Jeremiah in the Old Testament are deeply related to the ancient Near East and go all the way back to the times of Inanna and her hymnings, her praisings. And so it's not surprising that the reappearance of psalms of praise and lamentation by David should result in a kind of like a Bhagavad Gita of all hymns by his son Solomon. The Song of Songs in the Old Testament is very much in the whole line of hymns to Inanna, the goddess of life, the goddess of love, the bringer of joy, the bringer of the ability to survive grief, the ability to be royal in the face of a tendency of ritual to reduce everything down, to rote, to raise up the character of someone to their appreciation of love and life on a level where they glow. And the glowing always has this particular quality. In the ancient, all the way through to the contemporary, the glow is showed by a radiance that is there in a white robe, or a radiance that is there in the naked human body. The best illustration of it is a William Blake watercolor called Glad Day, where there's this burst of the aura energy of the nude figure bursting onto the scene of existence, complete, unified in their glory. And it is this quality in the hymning studies began to come out, a study of the language of love in the Songs of Songs and in ancient Egyptian poetry, the Song of Songs and the ancient Egyptian love songs. So that one found eventually that all of this tradition has a consistency, has a unity all the way through, recognizable again and again, so that no matter what level in that onion of deception, there is a dynamic that is consistent all the way through, that is truthful to nature. And with Jane Ellen Harrison, in her study, for the first time, one became tuned to the dynamic that was consistent despite the obfuscation of even contradictory layers, of even deceptive eras in human culture, in the limitations of the circumstance. And one of the biggest limitations to get over for her was that she was in an accultured imprisonment, emotionally and mentally, in one of the most subtle of all prisons, an empire that spanned the entire world. The British Empire, the sun never set on it. The entire planet was included. And so one had to literally go extraterrestrial to get out of it. To get out of being comfortable and safe and expecting that that was the world. But that was in fact the whole world, so it is the world. And when one goes back to Inanna, one finds for the first time that she is not limited to this world. She's the moon goddess. She has that quality of being able to be a goddess on earth, but she brings a moon energy. In fact, the phrase in ancient times translates still into ancient women's religion's phrase, drawing down the moon. Bringing the moon shining into the night on earth and creating the romance of love and life on the surface of the earth. And it was this energy that needed to be carried to the center of the earth, to the netherworld, to the realm of what would be the dead, to the nearest opposite to the heavens, hell, to carry the radiant quality of love and life to the center of hell, so that the light will have at least shined from this courageous angle of the goddess of love and life, carrying it all the way down. And when she reaches there, because the journey is so difficult, not because of competing layers of deception, but because of loss of all of the major coordinates of her ordination. Because when she gets to hell, when she gets to the center of her descent, there is no gravity. In the sense that she has any ordination, she doesn't know where she is, in the sense that she now is completely denuded and finds there her sister, Ereshkigal, the queen of the netherworld, is like a image of her mirrored sister, and that when she arrives there to the other side of herself, not a shadow side. That kind of talk is just as scholastic as anything that's medieval. She comes to the other side of her radiance, which is a radiance not to have any accoutrement of any of the order that belongs to the earth's structure. That hell has the quality of heaven also, in that it is mysterious in a continuousness of zero, and yet also of infinity. In scholastic Christian mythology, one didn't find on the most sophisticated levels that the devil was some kind of red-horned beast, but one found the accurate sketching in the margins, like in the margins of one of the pages of the Book of Kells, done about 950 AD. And the margin, not in the text, not illustrating it, but in the margin, was a burnt-out stick figure of a human being. A human being who was completely burnt out. That the devil did not have energy, but had oblivion. was evil because of oblivion, was a neuter, was neither male nor female, but was a neuter. And that contact with that kind of a mythic character, with the figure in a ritual sense like that, one's whole life energy shorted out. Not that you died, but that you were blanked out. You were erased. You were erased from the living. You were erased from any realm where love was viable, possible even. And so one of the qualities of Inanna in ancient mythology was that she, as well as being the gorgeous goddess of love and of life, she was the fierce protector of love and life to fight against oblivion. We will not be erased from reality. We will find some way to carry love and life to the center of the netherworld, to the center of hell, and to work a special kind of mysteriousness, and that is transform by exchange. That though all of the levels of possibility had faced oblivion and had acquired an absolute neuter nothingness at the center of hell, Inanna found that there was a possibility of having an exchange for herself if her husband Dumuzi would come and take her place. And if he would come and take her place to save her so that she could return to life, could return to love, she could, in a very high mystical way, also come back then and exchange with him and free him to come back. And so the whole quality of the last third of Jane Ellen Harrison's Prolegomena to the study of Greek religion is all about Orpheus. Orpheus is like a masculine Inanna who goes to hell to recover Eurydice and lead her back out, to bring her back out. But the shift in it is that the myth of Orpheus reduces it down, the Greek mythology of classical Athens, and then the Roman swallowing of Greek classical mythology kept reducing it so that the myth was simply that Orpheus goes down to hell to retrieve Eurydice, but if he turns to look at her, she will be lost to him forever, and she will fade and go back into hell. And because this happens in the classical Greek mythology and the Roman version of having swallowed that mythology whole without any critical understanding, so that the whole medieval Orpheus mythology was again a Christian, scholastic, Roman Empire version of the classical Greek, he always loses. He loses her. And she loses because she is not saved from hell. And because she is not saved from hell, he also carries then the disorientation of hell with him back into the earth, because he's not returned to life, he's not returned to love, he's not returned to the earth. And he will not sing, he cannot sing, he's disoriented. And so the women who depended upon his singing ability to calm them are enraged because he won't sing, and so they stone him to death, they kill him. There's a beautiful retelling of this version of the Orpheus myth in one of the films that we use in our education. The film Black Orpheus, set in Rio de Janeiro, made about 40 years ago. One of the world's great films. But the Orpheus mythology is not reducible to that skit. And one of the great achievements of Jane Ellen Harrison's book was to pluck two figures out of a reductive 19th century school mythology that was just a rote about Christian medievalism, Roman Empire, imperialism, classical Greek reductivism, and to bring Orpheus and Dionysius back out of the mental oblivion in which they had sunk by the time of the 1880s, 1890s. A real crucial time. And one of the trigger figures on bringing Dionysius out was Friedrich Nietzsche, the great philosopher. Because Nietzsche's, before he became a wild philosophic genius, he was a professor of classics. He wrote a book on the birth of Greek tragedy, published in 1872, in which for the first time he stylized a polarity of Apollo and Dionysius. That Apollo was the god of order and clarity, and Dionysius the god of confusion, of disorder, of wild, ecstatic life energies, and that these two were then polarized. It was with Jane Ellen Harrison's book that the whole polarization that Nietzsche had revolutionized Western philosophy with was brought into completely new perspective. Her immense genius at being able to see a wide field of not just information and figures, not just characters and ideas, but genuine understanding of a consciousness as a dimension, a special dimension of time-space, that as long as time-space is without a conscious dimension, that it is only integral. Then it does result in integral forms like ritual existence and symbolic mind. But as soon as consciousness comes into play, transform enters into the universe, and it becomes capable of not just being a universe, but being a realm of infinite possibilities. And so the universe changes into a cosmos. And that the whole mythology surrounding Dionysius and Orpheus is all about the transform of a set existence into a possibility of all kinds of lives. From a set universe into a realm of cosmic possibilities. Instead of there being a integral mind, which would supposedly be the master center of everything, there was the possibility of many different kinds of minds and many different facets within a single mind, so that one came out not with the calm central authority of a clear mind, but one came out with the kaleidoscopic mind, capable of a carnival of possibilities. And all of a sudden you had a different kind of human being possible. And it was a revelation. It was a revelation at the time, because the person bringing this out, spearheading this, was a woman, one of the first women to even be admitted to a university in England. When she went there, she was one of the first students admitted as a woman. And she not only came out of the parlor, she became one of the greatest Cambridge dons of all time. She was a star among stars. She was unbelievably fabulous. And all the time, she says in her own reminiscences, I am not the figure that the world has made of me. I'm a very timid, very opinionated person I like simple things. I like the bluntness of real life. I'm not ashamed to have a love life. I'm not ashamed to be who I am. And so all of this became cause célèbre in the time. By the time that she passed on in the 1920s, she had become a talisman for a new kind of people. In fact, her reminiscences, published in 1926, are published by Virginia Woolf and her husband Leonard. As all of this unfolded in the 19th and 20th centuries, it became more and more apparent there were isolated incidents, isolated figures that began to emerge, not burnt out on the margins of the pages, but vibrant, shining a completely new light and illuminating the texts of standard history, standard cultural, standard traditional, standard religious, standard educational, standard political. All of the standard qualities of civilization were being illuminated with completely new light. One of the things that came into play in the 1960s was the publication of this little volume here, Anchor Doubleday Original. This is a translation of the Psalms of David, done by Sir Philip Sidney and by his sister, the Countess of Pembroke. It was published here for the first time in the public in 1963. It was written in the 1500s in England, largely at their family castle in Wilton or in their London castle. In fact, Sir Philip Sidney died in 1585. He was one of the greatest poets in the world, He died in his early 30s. He was killed in a battle in the Netherlands because he was noble and was expected to be in battles, and he was killed, and he had only translated the first 43 Psalms. And so his sister, Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke, who was one of the most learned women of the English Renaissance, completed the translations of the Psalms of David into English. And they circulated in the early 1590s in a handwritten manuscript in London, and it's about the time that Shakespeare began writing his really great plays, like A Midsummer Night's Dream. Because the language of Sir Philip Sidney and his sister, Mary Sidney, the English language was informed in a way that few people had ever been informed, because they were raised to be multilingual. English Renaissance royalty like this, not only rich and royal but enormously intelligent, were educated from childhood to read and write and speak Greek and Hebrew and English and French. So when it came to Sir Philip Sidney and his sister reading the Psalms of David, they didn't have to read someone else's translation. They could read the Hebrew. And because Sir Philip Sidney, his best friend was Edmund Spenser, who wrote The Faerie Queene. His circle of genius friends were who's who of the English literary Renaissance before Shakespeare, just before him. And it was because of this translation of the Psalms of David directly from the Hebrew that the King James Version of the Bible was undertaken to be done. They realized that we have an English language now in the Renaissance that is cosmic. Elizabethan English by the time of Sir Philip Sidney and Spenser and Shakespeare is one of the glories of world history. It is a language that is able to go back to nature, a language that is able to do all kinds of different rituals with the very same set of existentials, and that has such an enrichment of the heartfulness of human experience that the language flow itself is like a melody of openness and of light, and out of that came a mind that was not just clear. As a center pivot, it was able to dance in its clarity. Just a few lines to let you get the tone. This translation was never published until 350 years later. They put out an antiquarian edition in 1823 of 250 copies. And the first time it was ever really published for the public was 1963. Why? Because its gorgeousness undercuts a lot of the theological authority of the King James Version of the Bible, because it presents the Psalms of David in the ancient brilliance in an English language. Listen to this. You'll recognize the psalm. The Lord my shepherd is, and so can never I taste misery. He rests me in green pasture, his. By waters still and sweet, he guides my feet. He me revives, leads me the way, which righteousness doth take, for his name's sake. Yea, though I should through valleys stray, of death's dark shade I will none whit fear ill. For thou, dear Lord, thou me besettest, thy rod and thy staff be to comfort me. Before me thou a table settest, even when foes' envious eye doth it espy. Thou oilest my head, thou fillest my cup. Nay, more, thou endless good shall give me food. To thee I say, ascend up, where thou, the Lord of all, dost hold thy hall. Psalm 23, about as famous as the Lord's Prayer in Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Western history. One has this aspect that from time to time, certain individuals and groups of people were able to penetrate through all of the layers of obfuscation and go back to original brilliance at several key nodes, not in the past only, but to bring those nodes present again and represent them. It was like a iteration that had never lost any stitch in all the time, in all the errors, in all the obfuscation, in all the authority manipulating and all the propaganda, and it was brought back original and fresh again. And that's what we're doing here. We're going back to every aspect of civilization on the planet and refreshing it. And so the selection of materials is a selection to bring us the entire treasure of the planet's capacity. There are wonders beyond belief. Here's a study published in Stockholm, the North American Indian Orpheus tradition, 1957. There are many standard great books on Orpheus. The best is Orpheus in Greek Religion, a study of the Orphic movement. W.K.C. Guthrie did a huge number of translations of Greek classic material, and then his son wrote a great 6-volume history of Greek philosophy in 6 volumes published by Cambridge. But it's due to Jane Ellen Harrison, that this whole movement began to churn in the 20th century, and it's the genius of Diane Volkstein and Samuel Noah Kramer. Kramer was the greatest Sumerian scholar of the 20th century. His books are numerous, and the most famous of them is History Begins at Sumer, going all the way back. And we talked last week about things, mythologies of the ancient world, many, many, many books. But he was wise enough to understand that when you are telling the mythology of Inanna, and you're going back to any Duana, you need a woman in her sensibility to be able to go back there. And so he provided her with the translations of the ancient Sumerian cuneiform so that she could then work that language in her own way. And out of this synergy came something extraordinary. One hears this. In the marshland may the fish and birds chatter. In the canebrake may the young and old reeds grow high. And the steppe may the mashur trees grow high. In the forest may the deer and wild goats multiply. In the orchards may there be honey and wine. In the gardens may the lettuce and cress grow high. In the palace may there be long life. May there be flood water in the Tigris and Euphrates. May the plants grow high on their banks and fill the meadows. May the Lady of Vegetation pile the grain in heaps and mounds. O my Queen of heaven and earth, Queen of all the universe, may he enjoy long days in the sweetness of your holy loins. And so one heard for the first time again the kind of direct, plain, nude, loving, living quality of radiance without the false proteres, without the obfuscations, without the undercurrents and cross-currents, without any of the propaganda of various groups pressured, not just little groups, but groups that have endured over a millennia. Authorities of all kinds. And so here at the beginning of the 21st century, we have a treasure trove. And yet, when one goes to any university in the world, you can't get this education. It's not there. So it's here. More next week.